What if Earth once knew something and forgot? Wherever you are tonight, I'm glad you're here. This is a quiet place, a slow place, a place where the planet remembers itself in fragments, in breath, in stone, in skies that no longer exist. Long before the air learned how to be gentle, before oxygen softened the light, before lungs and leaves agreed on a shared rhythm, the world exhaled something stranger, not empty, not alive, but not familiar. This is not a story of catastrophe. It is a story of waiting, of atmospheres forming and unforming, of gases rising like thoughts that never finish themselves, of a sky that tried many voices before choosing the one now taken for granted. If this drifting, unhurried way of listening feels right, consider staying a while, subscribing, liking, or sharing, so these quiet stories can continue to find their way through the dark. Before air learned how to carry gentleness, the planet exhaled without knowing why. The surface was not land yet, only intention, heat moving restlessly beneath a skin too thin to keep its secrets. Fire did not arrive. Fire was already everywhere, folded into stone, braided through pressure, humming beneath a sky that had not learned how to stay. There was no horizon, only gradients of brightness, where molten ground met a ceiling of vapor and ash. The atmosphere was not a shield, it was a consequence. Volcanoes did not erupt, they spoke continuously. Their language was sulfur and carbon, iron breath and water torn apart by heat. Plumes rose not as events, but as habits, building a roof of gases heavy with memory they had not yet earned. The sky pressed down, trapping warmth, recycling violence. Nothing escaped easily, not heat, not matter, not time. Each release from the crust became another layer in a thickening air that did not circulate so much as linger. Motion was slow, persistence was everything. Lightning stitched brief thoughts across the clouds, writing symbols that vanished as soon as they formed. Nitrogen held itself apart, patient and unreactive, while carbon dioxide gathered like a long-held sigh. Methane drifted in soft abundance, tinting the light, blurring the sun into something distant and unresolved. There was no blue, only bruised oranges and dim ambers, a sky that looked inward rather than up. Even light felt tired here, filtered through haze, bent by particles still warm from their making. Water existed, but not yet as ocean. It was vapor, breath without lungs, waiting for a reason to fall. Hydrogen tried to leave, always upward, always forgetting the ground. Gravity whispered, not loudly enough yet. Some gases listened, others did not. The atmosphere was learning what it could keep and what would abandon it without apology. Loss began early. It was not noticed. Meteorites arrived without warning or memory, punching through sky and surface alike. Each impact reheated the air, shook it loose, sent fragments of atmosphere spilling into space. And still the planet replaced what was taken, as if unaware of the theft. Degassing continued. The crust exhaled again and again, refilling absence with whatever chemistry could be spared. The sky was rebuilt not because it was precious, but because it was inevitable. Nothing breathed, nothing needed to. The air did not exist for life. Life did not exist to judge it. The atmosphere was chemistry thinking aloud, testing combinations, repeating itself until something different happened by accident. Sulfur painted the clouds with sharpness. Ammonia flickered briefly, unstable, eager to transform. Carbon monoxide lingered like an unfinished sentence. This was an alien sky, not because it was hostile, but because it was indifferent. It did not recognize fragility. It did not yet know the meaning of shelter. Time moved differently under this ceiling. Without seasons, without cycles, change arrived as accumulation. One more eruption, one more impact, one more slow cooling that never quite finished. The sky thickened, then thinned, then thickened again. Each phase left residue. Each failure wrote instructions in ash and pressure. Even when stripped away by solar wind or shattered by violence from above, the atmosphere returned altered, heavier, more reluctant to leave. The sun watched from closer than it would later stand, brighter, less forgiving. Ultraviolet light cut through the upper reaches of the air, breaking molecules apart, teaching the sky how easily it could be undone. Ozone did not yet exist to soften the glare. Protection was a future concept. For now, radiation moved freely, rearranging chemistry, leaving scars no surface could yet record. The atmosphere absorbed what it could, learned what it must, and let the rest pass through. This sky did not remember itself from moment to moment. Memory had not settled into layers yet, but the planet remembered in another way in repetition. Each cycle of loss and renewal refined the mixture slightly. Lighter gases slipped away more often. Heavier ones stayed. Pressure increased. Temperature steadied, not gently, but enough. The air began to press with consistency. Not comfort, consistency. Ash fell constantly, though there was nowhere for it to land meaningfully. Particles drifted down, were remelted, rose again. Nothing stayed separate for long. Boundaries blurred. Sky and surface traded material without ceremony. This exchange was the first conversation, long before words, long before breath. The planet spoke to itself through circulation, through gravity tugging on vapor, through heat insisting on motion. There was no intention here, only persistence, and in that persistence, a quiet preparation. The atmosphere did not know it was temporary. It did not know it would one day be unrecognizable. It existed fully, completely, as it was an alien arrangement that belonged to no witness. What would come later depended on this chaos, on this heavy, suffocating patience. Without this first sky, nothing else could practice becoming something better. But what the planet released, it would one day revise, and what rose first would not be what remained. Heat did not fade. It learned how to move. Beneath the young sky, energy wandered through the crust like a thought without language, never settling, never finishing itself. The ground was a slow ocean of stone, convecting, folding, forgetting its own shape. Above it, the atmosphere thickened, not because it was stable, but because it was constantly replaced. Every fissure, every glowing seam, released another measure of gas into the waiting dark. The planet breathed without rhythm, without pause. Carbon dioxide gathered weight. It pressed downward, trapping warmth with a patience that bordered on intent. The air became a blanket woven from volcanic habit, holding heat close, refusing to let the surface cool into stillness. Without this pressure, the planet might have frozen into silence. With it, everything remained restless. Temperature did not oscillate. It lingered. Nights did not bring relief. Days did not announce themselves clearly. Light arrived already tired, filtered through layers that blurred edges and softened shadows into indistinction. Sulfur compounds drifted like ghosts through the sky, sharp and metallic, staining the clouds with acrid presence. They did not last long, but they returned often. Each appearance altered the chemistry slightly, nudging reactions in new directions, then dissolving back into the background. Nothing here was permanent, but everything left an impression. The atmosphere learned through erosion, through repetition, through the slow wearing down of extremes. Water vapor continued its waiting. It rose from the surface whenever cooling allowed, only to be torn apart again by heat and radiation. Hydrogen escaped upward, light and forgetful, slipping past gravity's uncertain grasp. Oxygen did not yet know how to exist alone. When it appeared, briefly, it was consumed immediately, bound into rock or recombined into other molecules. The sky did not yet permit freedom. Everything belonged to something else. Above the thick lower layers, the upper atmosphere thinned into vulnerability. Here, the sun's breath was strongest. Solar wind pushed insistently, stripping away what it could, teaching the planet the cost of exposure. Without a strong magnetic field to turn that breath aside, loss was constant. The atmosphere leaked into space, not in dramatic bursts, but in steady forgetting. This loss did not empty the sky. It shaped it. What remained grew heavier, more reluctant to leave, more likely to sink back toward the surface and stay. Meteor impacts continued, not as interruptions but as punctuation. Each arrival compressed the air violently, momentarily thickening it, heating it, altering its chemistry in flashes of pressure and shock. After the blast, fragments of atmosphere escaped upward, while the rest resettled, changed. The sky was kneaded repeatedly, folded by force, smoothed by time. With every impact, the mixture shifted slightly. learning which combinations could survive disturbance. Nitrogen endured. Quiet, inert, it accumulated without drama, filling space, stabilizing pressure. It did not react often, did not announce itself, but it stayed. Over time, its presence began to matter. It diluted more aggressive gases, softened chemical extremes, offered the first hint of balance. The atmosphere did not yet understand equilibrium, but it was beginning to practice restraint. The planet rotated beneath this sky, though rotation meant little without markers. There were no seasons to divide time, no cycles to repeat meaningfully. Change arrived as deepening, as thickening, as a gradual lowering of chaos into something closer to order. The air pressed more evenly. Heat circulated more slowly. Differences smoothed themselves out over vast stretches of time that felt like stillness. Ash continued to rise and fall, endlessly recycled. Fine particles remained suspended for long ages, scattering light, cooling the surface slightly even as greenhouse gases warmed it from below. Opposing forces coexisted without resolving themselves. The atmosphere became a place of tension held gently, not yet a place of harmony. This tension was necessary. It kept the planet from choosing an ending too soon. There was no sound as it would later be understood, but there was vibration. Pressure waves moved through the air, after eruptions and impacts, rippling outward, fading slowly. These waves carried information without awareness, teaching the atmosphere how to transmit disturbance, how to absorb it, how to return to its previous state without memory of the shock. Resilience was forming, quietly. This first sky did not protect the surface from the cosmos. It invited the cosmos in. Radiation, particles, fragments of distant events passed freely through the upper layers, altering molecules, seeding reactions, contributing to a chemistry that was not entirely local. The atmosphere was open, porous, unfinished. It was shaped by the planet, but also by everything the planet encountered. In this openness, complexity began to gather without direction. Molecules collided, separated, recombined. Some arrangements lasted longer than others. Most dissolved back into simpler forms. But the rules were being written even as they were tested. The sky was becoming a laboratory without walls, running experiments no observer could record. What formed here would not survive unchanged. This atmosphere was not destined to last. It existed to fail, to be replaced, to teach the planet how to hold a different kind of air later. Every escape of hydrogen, every loss to solar wind, every chemical dead end refined the conditions for something else. The planet was learning, not consciously, but through the only method it had, endurance. And beneath this heavy, unbreathable sky, the surface slowly cooled, just enough to begin imagining solidity. Not yet land, not yet ocean, but the possibility of staying in one shape for longer than a moment. The atmosphere pressed down, insisting on warmth, insisting on time. What rose first would not be what remained, and what remained would carry the ash of this beginning, folded deep into its memory, even after the sky learned a new way to exist. Cooling did not arrive as relief. It arrived as hesitation. The surface began to pause between movements, holding its shape for fractions of time that slowly lengthened. Stone remembered being liquid and resisted the memory, stiffening, cracking, then softening again beneath relentless heat. Above it, the atmosphere adjusted without noticing, responding to shifts below with changes in pressure, density, and drift. The sky was no longer only rising. In places, it began to settle. Water finally learned how to fall. Not as rain yet, but as a suggestion of it, condensation gathering in heavy clouds, droplets forming only to be torn apart again by warmth before reaching the ground. Each attempt left a trace. Each failure cooled the air slightly, carried heat upward, redistributed energy in new patterns. The atmosphere began to circulate with intention, though it did not yet know the word. Motion found pathways, currents formed and dissolved. The sky practiced movement. Carbon dioxide remained dominant, thick and persistent, holding warmth close to the surface. But its rule was no longer absolute. Nitrogen continued its quiet accumulation, smoothing pressure differences, lending stability without claiming attention. Methane lingered, its presence softening light, creating a faint, perpetual twilight that blurred distinctions between day and night. Under this dim sky, the surface cooled unevenly, creating gradients that drove winds slow enough to be almost imagined. Lightning returned often, born of instability, of charge building in clouds heavy with ash and vapor. Each strike rearranged molecules, breaking and reforming bonds in flashes too brief to remember. These moments were not special. They were common, but repetition has its own power. The same reactions occurred again and again, increasing the chance that something unusual might last a little longer than before. The sky did not aim for complexity. It allowed it. The sun continued to work from above, reshaping the upper atmosphere with steady insistence. Ultraviolet light split water vapor, freeing hydrogen to escape and leaving oxygen behind, briefly. That oxygen rarely stayed free for long. It bound itself to iron, to sulfur, to anything willing. The sky learned quickly that oxygen was dangerous to permanence. It was reactive, disruptive, eager to change everything it touched. For now, the atmosphere kept it rare. Lost to space continued, but more selectively. As heavier gases dominated, escape slowed. The atmosphere thickened in the lower layers, pressing down with greater consistency. Pressure became something the surface could feel, something that influenced how heat moved, how materials behaved. The sky began to matter not just as chemistry, but as weight, as presence. Impacts became less frequent, though never absent. Each one still shook the atmosphere, but the sky recovered more quickly now, absorbing the shock, redistributing energy, returning to its prior state with increasing ease. This resilience was not memory, but it was close. The atmosphere was learning how to be itself again after disturbance. Identity, however temporary, was forming. Clouds began to persist longer, thick bands of vapor and ash stretching across the sky. In their shadows, the surface cooled further, allowing crust to thicken to resist remelting. These moments of relative calm created feedback. Cooler surfaces released fewer gases. Reduced degassing allowed the atmosphere to thin slightly, which in turn permitted more cooling. Balance flirted with existence, never staying long, but returning more often. When water finally reached the surface, it did not stay. It flashed back into vapor upon contact with heat, rising again, carrying energy with it. But each cycle transferred heat upward, slowly draining the surface of its excess. The atmosphere became an engine of redistribution, moving energy away from the ground, even as it trapped enough warmth to prevent complete solidification. This delicate tension held the planet in a prolonged in-between. The sky remained alien. No breath could pass through it. No softness existed in its chemistry, but it was becoming organized. Patterns repeated, cycles lengthened, extremes softened slightly. The atmosphere was no longer a chaotic outpouring. It was a system in rehearsal, testing limits, adjusting boundaries. In the lower air, pressure and temperature gradients drove slow winds that traced the planet's rotation. These movements were gentle compared to what would come later, but they mattered. They mixed gases, distributed heat, blurred local differences into global tendencies. The atmosphere learned how to be planetary rather than local, how to belong to the whole surface rather than to individual vents and impacts. Ash continued to fall, but less densely now. Some particles settled long enough to be buried, sequestered, removed from circulation. The sky slowly cleared, not into blue, but into transparency of a sort. Light reached the surface more directly, warming some regions while leaving others cooler. Contrast increased. With contrast came motion. With motion came opportunity. This first atmosphere did not imagine futures. It did not prepare for life, but it created conditions where change could slow down enough to accumulate, where reactions could repeat often enough to matter, where the planet could begin to hold on to what it made. The sky still lost pieces of itself to space. It still invited radiation to pass through. It still smelled of sulfur and metal, but it had learned patience. It had learned how to stay, at least for a while. And in that staying, something new waited just beyond recognition, folded into pressure, hidden in cycles, resting beneath a sky that was already beginning to forget how strange it once was. Stability did not announce itself. It arrived as longer pauses between upheavals, as silence stretched thin across ages that once would have burned away. The surface cooled enough to keep its shape for longer spans, allowing the atmosphere above it to respond not with panic, but with adjustment. Heat rose more predictably now, carried upward by convection that traced familiar paths. The sky began to develop habits. Clouds thickened and spread, no longer isolated plumes but broad canopies that drifted slowly, reshaping how light reached the ground. In their shadow, temperatures dropped just enough to let water linger. Steam condensed more often, droplets growing heavier, falling farther before vanishing. Each fall carried heat away from the surface, gifting it briefly to the air. The atmosphere learned how to cool the world without extinguishing it. Carbon dioxide still ruled, but its dominance softened. Weathering began quietly, without landscapes to admire. When water touched newly cooled rock, reactions occurred that pulled carbon from the air and locked it into stone. These exchanges were slow, almost imperceptible, but relentless. With each cycle, the atmosphere thinned by an unmeasurable amount, lightened by a fraction. The sky did not notice the change. The planet did. Pressure continued to increase in the lower atmosphere, pressing gently but firmly, encouraging gases to remain close to the surface. Escape to space slowed further as the composition grew heavier, more reluctant to rise. Gravity's whisper became clearer. The atmosphere listened. What once fled upward now lingered, mixing, circulating, learning how to belong. The sun still burned brighter than it would later, but its influence was tempered by the thickening air. Ultraviolet light met resistance now, scattered, absorbed, reshaped before reaching the surface. Molecules broke and reformed higher up, sparing the ground some of their violence. The sky had not yet learned protection, but it had begun to practice it by accident. Lightning continued its quiet work, less frequent now as conditions smoothed, but still present enough to stir chemistry. Each strike rearranged gases, creating fleeting compounds that drifted, collided, dissolved. Some of these reactions produced heavier molecules, more complex arrangements that lingered just long enough to influence their surroundings. Complexity did not arrive suddenly. It seeped in. Winds traced slow planetary paths, driven by differences in heating and the steady turn of the world beneath them. These movements spread gases evenly, reducing extremes, encouraging uniformity. The atmosphere became more cohesive, less fractured. It began to feel like a single entity rather than a collection of local plumes. This cohesion mattered. It allowed the sky to respond as a whole. Water finally found moments of persistence. In cooler regions, it pooled briefly, thin films shimmering before boiling away. Each appearance left minerals behind, altered rock surfaces, deepened weathering. With every contact, more carbon was drawn from the air, more heat was redistributed. The atmosphere and surface engaged in a slow exchange, each shaping the other through touch and retreat. Ash fell less often now, though volcanoes still spoke regularly. Their voices had softened, less explosive, more rhythmic. Gases released were quickly absorbed into the existing sky, diluted, mixed. The atmosphere no longer surged wildly with each eruption. It adjusted, flexed, returned to its prior state with increasing ease. Resilience had become routine. The sky remained unbreathable, thick with gases hostile to fragile chemistry, but it was no longer entirely chaotic. Patterns repeated often enough to be anticipated by the planet's processes, if not by any awareness. Feedback loops formed, reinforcing stability, discouraging extremes. The atmosphere began to act as a mediator, not just a byproduct. Time deepened. Millions of years passed like quiet breaths, each one slightly cooler, slightly calmer than the last. The surface continued to solidify, crust thickening, continents dreaming their first outlines beneath oceans not yet fully formed. Above them, the sky pressed down, warm and heavy, refusing to let the planet slip into frozen stillness. This was still an alien atmosphere. Its chemistry would suffocate anything familiar. Its pressure would crush delicate structures. Its light was dim and unfocused. But it had learned how to wait, and waiting changed everything. The sky no longer existed only to vent the planet's interior. It had become a participant in shaping the future, even if it did not know the role it was rehearsing. Each cycle of cooling and circulation, each molecule that stayed instead of leaving, nudged the planet closer to another threshold. What began as ash and violence had become continuity. Not breath, not yet, but the space where breath might one day find room. And beneath this sky, the planet held its heat a little more gently, as if listening for something it had not yet imagined. The atmosphere learned impermanence before it learned form. No sky was allowed to believe it would remain. Each version rose, spread, and thinned again, as if the planet were testing how much could be held before forgetting became inevitable. Above the young world, gravity was still practicing its grip. It spoke softly, uncertain of its authority, while lighter gases listened only long enough to leave. Hydrogen rose without hesitation, carrying with it the memory of heat and water torn apart by light. Helium followed, indifferent, already halfway to elsewhere. The sky was full, yet constantly emptying. Presence was temporary. Loss was continuous. The sun hovered closer in those ages, louder, more demanding. Its breath solar wind pressed against the upper reaches of the atmosphere, stripping particles away grain by grain. There was no sudden tearing, only erosion, a thinning so gradual it felt like patience. The sky learned that exposure had a cost, that openness invited removal. What could not anchor itself drifted off, joining silence beyond the planet's reach. Each time the atmosphere grew thick, it was tested. Radiation split molecules apart, scattering their fragments upward. Without protection, without shielding, the upper air was a place of forgetting. Molecules lost their companions. Bonds dissolved. The sky was unmade in slow motion, its lightest thoughts carried away into space. What remained sank lower, heavier, closer to the surface, learning the comfort of weight. Impacts returned without warning, not frequent now, but decisive. When they came, they compressed the air violently, heating it, flinging pieces of it outward. Shock waves rippled through the sky, briefly thickening it, then tearing holes through which gases escaped. Afterward, the atmosphere resettled thinner than before, altered, quieter. Each impact rewrote the ceiling. The planet responded not with resistance, but with persistence. Volcanoes continued their long speech, releasing gases to replace what was lost. Carbon dioxide rose again. Nitrogen followed, steady and unassuming. Water vapor joined them when heat allowed. The sky was rebuilt repeatedly, never identical, never entirely new. Each reconstruction learned from the last, favoring what stayed longest, abandoning what fled most easily. Hydrogen became rare. Its absence was not noticed, but its effects were felt. Water grew heavier, less eager to escape. The atmosphere slowly lost its lightness, its tendency to vanish. What remained pressed down more firmly, thickening the lower air, strengthening gravity's hold. The sky began to understand anchoring, though it did not yet master it. Still, nothing stayed long enough to settle into memory. The atmosphere existed in drafts, provisional arrangements shaped by loss as much as by creation. It was a ceiling written in pencil, erased repeatedly by sunlight and impact. The planet did not mourn these vanished skies. Each disappearance was instruction, teaching what could not survive in this place. The upper atmosphere thinned into vulnerability. Here, particles moved faster, heated by radiation, more likely to escape the planet's grasp. This boundary between staying and leaving shifted constantly, rising and falling with temperature, composition, and solar intensity. The sky learned edges. It learned thresholds. It learned that survival depended on remaining below certain heights, within certain weights. Magnetic whispers began deep within the planet, faint and inconsistent. They offered brief deflection, moments where solar wind was turned aside instead of allowed through. These moments mattered more than they seemed. Where protection flickered, the atmosphere lingered longer. Where it failed, loss resumed. The planet began to sense the value of shielding, even before it could maintain it. Nitrogen continued to accumulate, quietly altering everything. Its presence did not stop escape, but it diluted extremes, slowed reactions, stabilized pressure. The sky became less volatile, more cohesive. Though it could still be stripped away, it now resisted just enough to leave a trace behind. Loss was no longer complete. Residue remained. The atmosphere's colour shifted subtly as composition changed. Haze thinned, light sharpened. The sun's glare grew harsher in places, colder in others. Temperature contrasts increased, driving winds that mixed the air more thoroughly. This mixing mattered. It spread loss evenly, prevented weak points from forming too easily. The sky learned how to share its wounds. Still, this was a sky that could not stay. Not yet. Too much escaped. Too much was undone. Every attempt at permanence dissolved under pressure from above and within. The atmosphere existed in rehearsal, practicing forms it would abandon later, and yet, with each cycle of loss and return, something remained. Heavier gases lingered. Pressure increased fraction by fraction. The planet learned what it could keep by watching what it lost. Impermanence was not failure. It was refinement. The sky faded and returned so many times that forgetting became a method. Each vanished atmosphere cleared space for another attempt, another composition, another chance to remain just a little longer. What stayed longest would shape the future. What left first would be remembered only by absence. And beneath this restless ceiling, the planet continued to turn, patient, knowing that a sky does not need to stay forever to matter. Loss became a rhythm, not a catastrophe, not an ending, but a pulse the planet learned to expect. The upper air was always thinning, always unraveling at the edges. Particles warmed by sunlight moved faster, forgetting the pull beneath them. Some drifted upwards slowly, others escaped in sudden freedom, their departure unnoticed by what remained. The sky did not collapse. It eroded. A slow surrender that left no scar, only absence. Hydrogen was almost gone now. Not entirely, but rare enough to matter. Its leaving altered the character of the air, making what remained heavier, more deliberate. Water changed with it. No longer eager to flee, vapour lingered longer before rising beyond reach. Condensation became more common. Falling became possible. Each loss rewrote behaviour below. Solar wind pressed constantly, shaping the atmosphere like sand beneath an unseen tide. Where the planet's magnetic voice was weakest, the sky thinned fastest. Where it held, even briefly, the air survived longer, learning how to curve around that protection. The atmosphere became uneven in its vulnerability, developing regions of endurance and regions of forgetting. These differences drove motion, stirring the sky into slow circulation. Radiation continued to fracture molecules, but now the fragments often recombined before escaping. Density increased just enough to encourage reunion. Bonds broken were sometimes restored. This was new. The atmosphere began to repair itself, not intentionally, but through proximity. Heavier gases clustered, sharing energy, sharing space. Survival emerged from togetherness. Nitrogen's quiet dominance shaped everything. It filled gaps left by fleeing elements, smoothing pressure gradients, stabilizing the lower air. It did not react often, but its presence made reactions safer for others. The sky grew less explosive, less prone to sudden transformation. Volatility softened into patience. Carbon dioxide remained abundant, though its rule was challenged by gradual sequestration below. Each time water touched rock, carbon was drawn downward, stored, to removed from circulation. This loss was not violent. It was a quiet theft by stone. The atmosphere thinned imperceptibly, losing some of its heat-trapping power, allowing cooler moments to persist longer. These cooler moments mattered. They lowered the upper atmosphere's temperature, reducing the speed at which particles moved, slowing escape. Loss continued, but at a gentler pace. The sky learned that cooling was a kind of defense. It did not stop forgetting, but it delayed it. Impacts still arrived, fewer now, but their influence remained profound. Each collision heated the air, expanded it upward, briefly increasing escape. Afterward, as temperatures fell again, the atmosphere contracted, settling closer to the surface. These pulses of expansion and contraction reshaped the sky repeatedly, testing its ability to return to form. With each test, recovery improved. The planet's rotation traced steady patterns beneath the air, encouraging circulation that spread heat and composition evenly. No single region bore all the loss. The sky shared its erosion, distributing thinning across latitudes, across altitudes. This sharing prevented collapse. Uniform weakness became strength. Clouds drifted slowly. More common now, though still heavy with ash and chemical sharpness. Their presence reflected sunlight, cooled the surface, and redistributed energy upward. Each cloud was temporary, but together they shaped climate, smoothing extremes, lengthening calm. Calm allowed density. Density resisted loss. The atmosphere began to feel its own weight. Pressure near the surface increased, encouraging gases to remain grounded. Escape required more energy now, more heating, more disruption. The sky did not stay, but it lingered longer than before. Time itself seemed to stretch. Still, impermanence defined this era. Every arrangement was provisional. The atmosphere existed knowing, in its chemistry, if not its awareness, that it would be altered again. It did not resist change. It accommodated it, reshaping itself after each removal, each erosion, each forgetting. The sun slowly grew less aggressive as distance increased and activity changed. Its influence softened, not suddenly, but enough to matter. Radiation still fractured the upper air, but with slightly less insistence. Solar winds still stripped particles away, but with diminishing reach. The sky noticed the difference, responding with thicker persistence. Magnetic protection deepened, becoming more consistent, turning aside some of the sun's breath. This deflection was not perfect, but it reduced loss enough to allow accumulation. The atmosphere crossed another quiet threshold, becoming something that could imagine staying, even if it could not yet succeed. Impermanence had taught the planet what permanence required: weight, density, shielding, balance. The sky was still fragile, still vulnerable, still temporary, but it was learning the conditions under which it might remain. Each vanished atmosphere was not erased. It was folded into the next, its lessons embedded in composition and behavior. Forgetting became memory by another name, and in that memory, the planet prepared, not for breath yet, but for a sky that could one day stay long enough to matter. Time pressed gently now, no longer rushing past in bursts of violence. The planet turned beneath a thinning sun, carrying its atmosphere like a thought it was still learning how to finish. Loss continued, but it no longer dominated. It shared the stage with accumulation, with repair, with moments where the sky simply remained as it was. The upper air cooled more often, shrinking closer to the surface. Particles moved more slowly here, less eager to escape, more likely to collide and return. Each collision redistributed energy, softened extremes, encouraged stability. The boundary between staying and leaving descended, tightening the grip of gravity without force. What had once drifted away now hesitated. Radiation still reached deep, but its path was increasingly scattered. Denser lower layers absorbed and redirected energy, protecting what lay beneath them by accident rather than design. Molecules fractured and reformed in cycles that grew shorter, less destructive. Repair became as common as damage. The sky learned how to endure. Carbon continued to leave the air quietly, drawn downward by stone and water. This thinning altered climate, cooling the surface further, reducing the expansion of the upper atmosphere. Escape slowed again. Each fraction of cooling reinforced the next, forming a gentle feedback that favored staying over leaving. The sky began to reward patience. Nitrogen filled space generously, maintaining pressure even as other gases diminished. Its presence allowed the atmosphere to remain substantial, without relying solely on heat-trapping compounds. This shift mattered. The sky no longer depended entirely on greenhouse warmth to exist. It could hold itself together through mass and cohesion. Impacts, when they came, were absorbed more gracefully now. Shockwaves still rippled through the air, but they dissipated faster, leaving less damage behind. After each disturbance, the atmosphere returned to its previous state with increasing familiarity. Recovery had become routine. The sky was learning how to forget disturbance while remembering itself. Magnetic protection strengthened subtly, turning aside more of the sun's breath, reducing erosion at the edges. Loss continued in places, but it was no longer universal. Regions of endurance expanded, allowing the atmosphere to thicken unevenly, then mix, spreading resilience. The sky learned how to share its strength. Clouds reflected more light now, cooling the surface further, while trapping enough warmth below to prevent collapse. This balance held for longer stretches, allowing cycles to lengthen, rhythms to form. Weather was still primitive, but it existed patterns of movement and exchange that repeated often enough to matter. Water lingered longer on the surface, pooling briefly before evaporating again. Each appearance altered rock, increased weathering, drew more carbon downward. With each cycle, the atmosphere thinned slightly, cooled slightly, stabilized slightly. Change was incremental, layered, almost unnoticeable except over deep time. The sky's color continued to shift, growing clearer, less hazed by ash. Light reached the surface more directly, warming some regions while leaving others cooler. These contrasts drove circulation that mixed the air thoroughly, preventing stagnation. The atmosphere became dynamic without being chaotic. Impermanence remained, but it had changed character. Loss was no longer the defining feature. It was one process among many. The sky still could not stay entirely, but it stayed long enough to develop habits, to establish baselines, to imagine continuity. What remained after each erosion was more refined, more suited to endurance. Heavier gases dominated, pressure increased. Escape required more energy than the environment could often provide. The atmosphere edged closer to permanence without claiming it. The planet did not rush this transition. There was no urgency. Time was abundant. Each iteration of the sky was allowed to fail slowly, teaching the conditions under which it might succeed next time. Forgetting remained useful. It cleared away what could not endure. In this era, the sky existed as an idea being tested repeatedly. Each version answered the same question differently. How much can be held, and for how long? The answers grew more confident, more stable, more quiet. Soon, a sky would arrive that could stay not forever, not unchanged, but long enough to become background, long enough to be mistaken for permanence, long enough to cradle something fragile. But this chapter belongs to what came before that success, to the skies that rose and fell, that thinned and returned, that taught the planet through loss rather than preservation. A sky that could not stay was not a failure. It was a rehearsal for remembering. And beneath its thinning presence, the planet waited, patient as stone, for the next threshold to arrive. The atmosphere began to recognize duration, not permanence, but stretch. Intervals lengthened between moments of loss, and in those intervals the sky practiced being present. Pressure held steady for longer spans. Composition shifted more slowly. The air no longer felt like a passing thought. It felt like a condition. The upper boundary of the sky lowered, settling closer to the planet, where gravity's influence was gentler but constant. Particles warmed by sunlight rose, slowed, and turned back more often than they escaped. Each return thickened the lower layers by an amount too small to notice, yet large enough to matter across ages. The sky learned to recycle itself. Magnetic shelter strengthened into a more reliable whisper, bending some of the sun's breath aside. Where this protection held, erosion eased. Where it faltered, loss continued. The atmosphere adapted by mixing, spreading resilience from protected regions into vulnerable ones. Circulation became survival. Movement became memory. Carbon dioxide continued its slow retreat into stone and sea, reducing the atmosphere's grip on heat. Cooling followed, modest but persistent. This cooling calmed the upper air, slowing escape further, reinforcing density below. Each molecule that stayed made it easier for the next to remain. The sky crossed another subtle threshold, one defined not by abundance, but by restraint. Nitrogen now shaped the atmosphere's character. Its quiet mass stabilized pressure, cushioned reactions, and filled space without demanding attention. In its presence, extremes softened. Chemistry slowed just enough to allow patterns to repeat reliably. The sky grew predictable in its unpredictability. Water lingered longer at the surface, forming transient pools, shallow seas that flashed into vapor and returned again. Each cycle deepened weathering, drew more gases downward, and redistributed heat upward. The atmosphere and surface spoke constantly through these exchanges, refining one another without awareness. This dialogue mattered more than any single event. The sun's influence softened further, not by intention, but by distance and change. Radiation still fractured molecules, but fewer escaped afterward. Solar wind still stripped particles away, but its reach diminished. The sky noticed only through effect, responding by thickening where it could, lingering where it was allowed. Clouds persisted longer now, spreading light, cooling days, warming nights. Contrast softened, gradients smoothed, winds traced slow, global paths, distributing composition evenly. The atmosphere felt whole, continuous, less like a patchwork of vulnerabilities. It behaved like a system that expected to remain. Still, it could not stay entirely. Loss never ceased. Erosion continued at the edges, patient and inevitable. But loss no longer defined the sky's existence. It shaped it gently, trimming excess, refining composition, teaching balance. The atmosphere learned that staying did not mean resisting change, but accommodating it. Time passed without urgency. Millions of years layered themselves quietly, each one adjusting the sky by fractions too small to feel. Yet the accumulation was unmistakable. The atmosphere that remained was heavier, calmer, more cohesive than any before it. It held warmth without suffocation. It cooled without collapse. It hovered in a narrow range where continuity was possible. This sky was still alien. Breath would fail within it. Chemistry remained hostile to softness. But it had learned something essential: how to remain long enough to matter, how to serve as background rather than event, how to be mistaken, eventually, for something natural. The planet did not celebrate this progress. Celebration requires memory. Instead, it continued turning, releasing gases when needed, drawing others downward, adjusting pressure and temperature with indifference. The sky was allowed to exist without scrutiny, to practice endurance without reward. Impermanence had taught the planet the shape of persistence. Each vanished atmosphere had contributed to this one, leaving behind lessons etched into chemistry and motion. Forgetting became layered knowledge, folded into density and drift. Soon, the sky would face a different challenge, not lost to space, but transformation from within. A change that would not thin it, but poison it, rewrite it, turn its chemistry against itself. That story waited beyond this moment. For now, the sky lingered. Not forever, but long enough to become the stage on which something quieter would begin. And what the planet allowed to stay, it did not yet understand. Some truths are not lost. They are simply folded beneath silence. The sky did not become hostile. It revealed that it always had been. What lingered above the cooling surface was not air meant to be shared. It was chemistry that tolerated no softness, a mixture shaped by fire and loss, unconcerned with futures it could not yet imagine. The atmosphere had learned how to stay, but it had not learned how to be kind. Its endurance came at a cost paid by anything fragile enough to notice. Carbon dioxide pressed downward, steady and unyielding, holding warmth close to the ground like a heavy thought that refused to release itself. Methane drifted beside it, softening light, bending the sun into a dim presence behind veils of haze. Together they shaped a sky that glowed faintly, not bright, not dark, but suspended in a muted, amber calm. Heat lingered, cold hesitated. Balance existed, but it was not gentle. Sulfur returned often, never for long, staining clouds with sharpness before dissolving again. Its presence altered reactions, encouraged corrosion, reminded the surface that stability was provisional. Ammonia appeared briefly, then vanished, unwilling to remain in such company. Carbon monoxide lingered longer, unfinished, half-formed, carrying energy without resolution. The sky felt crowded with molecules that wanted something else, something not yet available. Oxygen was present only as a rumor. When it appeared split from water by light or collision, it was consumed immediately, seized by rock, bound into minerals, erased as quickly as it formed. Freedom was not permitted. The atmosphere did not allow such reactivity to wander unchecked. Anything too eager to change the world was silenced. This air would have suffocated futures not yet born. It would have dissolved delicate structures before they could gather meaning. But there was nothing to suffocate, nothing to dissolve. The planet existed comfortably beneath this poisonous patience, its surface shaped by chemistry that harmed only what did not yet exist. Time stretched. Millions of years passed beneath this sky without urgency. The atmosphere did not fluctuate wildly now. Its composition shifted slowly, altered by exchanges with stone and water rather than by sudden loss. Carbon left the air quietly, drawn downward into rock through weathering and burial. Each removal thinned the sky by an amount too small to feel. Yet the effect accumulated. Methane lingered longer in this era, its presence warming the planet beneath a dim Sunday. Without it, cold might have claimed the surface too early. With it, warmth persisted just enough to allow water to move, to touch rock, to rearrange chemistry. The poison was also a protector. Hostility carried patience within it. Clouds thickened with haze, scattering light, muting extremes. Days and nights blurred into one another beneath a sky that rarely cleared. This softness of contrast mattered. It reduced thermal shock, encouraged circulation, allowed reactions to repeat under similar conditions again and again. Repetition gave chemistry time to explore itself. Lightning still crossed the sky, less violently now, but often enough to matter. Each strike rearranged molecules, breaking bonds, encouraging new ones to form. Most arrangements dissolved quickly. Some lingered just long enough to interact with others. Complexity did not arrive. But possibility widened. Water cycled constantly, evaporating, condensing, falling, rising again. Each cycle redistributed heat and matter, pulled gases from the air, returned others. The atmosphere and surface engaged in an endless exchange, neither dominating, neither yielding completely. This dialogue refined the poison, softened its edges without removing its danger. Nitrogen remained, quiet and abundant, filling space without reacting, stabilizing pressure, cushioning extremes. In its presence, chemistry slowed just enough to allow patience. Reactions that once would have raced now lingered, explored alternatives, settled into less volatile pathways. The sky grew calmer without becoming gentle. The sun's light continued to fracture molecules high above, but fewer fragments escaped now. Density encouraged reunion. What broke often reformed, returning to circulation rather than leaving forever. The atmosphere learned how to recycle its own violence, turning disruption into continuity. This sky did not aim toward life. It did not anticipate breath. It existed fully as itself, poisonous and persistent, hostile and necessary. Its patience was its most important feature. It allowed time to pass without catastrophe, allowed the planet to cool gradually, allowed chemistry to deepen without rushing toward collapse. The poison learned how to wait, and in that waiting, something subtle shifted. Not a transformation, not yet, but a soft narrowing of extremes, a quiet refining of conditions, a sky that no longer erased possibility as quickly as it once had. What would come next would not arrive as rescue. It would arrive as intrusion. But for now, the poison rested above the planet, patient, enduring, holding space for a future it did not yet recognize. The atmosphere settled into endurance, not stillness, but a careful holding of itself. Heat remained, but it no longer surged. It lingered evenly, pressed down by carbon and methane that refused to leave. The sky became a vessel, containing energy rather than releasing it. This containment mattered. It allowed reactions to repeat under similar conditions, allowing chemistry to grow familiar with itself. Familiarity bred stability. Carbon dioxide continued its quiet withdrawal, molecule by molecule, drawn downward by water and stone. Each removal altered the balance slightly, easing the pressure of warmth, encouraging cooler moments to last longer. But methane compensated, absorbing light, holding heat, preventing collapse. The poison adjusted itself, redistributing its influence without awareness. Methane's presence softened the sun's glare, creating a world of dim light and long shadows. Under this amber haze, temperature differences diminished. Winds slowed, The atmosphere moved with deliberation rather than urgency. Slow movement favored mixing, and mixing favored patience. Extremes were diluted before they could dominate. Sulfur compounds still appeared, sharp and temporary, stirring reactions, then fading. Their brief intrusions mattered less now. The atmosphere absorbed them, neutralized them, returned to its baseline with ease. Resilience had become habit. Oxygen remained rare and unwelcome. When it formed, it was quickly claimed, bound into rock, rusting surfaces invisible beneath haze and water. The sky did not tolerate such reactivity. Oxygen threatened balance by changing everything it touched. The atmosphere silenced it through chemistry, keeping it scarce, keeping the poison intact. Lightning strikes continued to punctuate the clouds, creating fleeting moments of intensity. These flashes rearranged molecules, producing compounds that would not otherwise exist. Most vanished quickly. Some persisted long enough to influence their surroundings, to participate in further reactions. Each strike expanded the chemical vocabulary of the sky without settling on any one phrase. Water cycled endlessly, its movement shaping the atmosphere as much as any gas. Evaporation carried heat upward, condensation returned it gently. Rain fell more often now, cooling the surface, dissolving gases, transporting matter between air and rock. Each drop was an exchange, each cycle a negotiation. The poison softened without becoming safe. Nitrogen's quiet presence continued to stabilize everything. It filled the sky generously, absorbing energy, moderating reactions. Without it, the poison would have been more violent, more volatile. With it, chemistry learned restraint. The sun's influence remained constant, fracturing molecules high above, but fewer fragments escaped. Density encouraged recombination. Loss slowed further. The atmosphere became more self-contained, recycling its components, preserving its mass. What once fled now returned. Time layered itself gently. Millions of years passed beneath this unbreathable sky without disruption. The planet cooled incrementally, its surface growing more complex, its crust thickening, its chemistry diversifying. The atmosphere responded to these changes without drama, adjusting composition, redistributing heat, maintaining continuity. This era did not feel transitional. It felt complete. The sky had found a way to exist without urgency, without constant loss. It was poisonous, yes, but it was stable. Stability allowed patience, patience allowed time, and time allowed subtle shifts to accumulate. Carbon continued its descent into stone. Methane slowly thinned as reactions and sunlight chipped away at it. These changes were gradual, imperceptible, but persistent. The balance that held the poison together began to drift. The atmosphere did not resist. It adjusted. As methane waned, cooling increased slightly. Clouds thickened. Albedo rose. The surface reflected more light. Temperature gradients shifted. Circulation patterns changed. The sky adapted without noticing that it was changing. Oxygen still flickered briefly, still vanished quickly. But its appearances grew marginally more frequent, just enough to matter later. For now, the poison remained dominant, patient, in control. This was a sky that could endure without nurturing. A sky that allowed chemistry to practice complexity without inviting fragility. A sky that prepared the planet not by kindness, but by restraint. The poison did not rush to end itself. It waited, and in that waiting, it unknowingly prepared the conditions for its own undoing. Time deepened into habit. The sky became familiar with itself. Nothing dramatic announced the passing of eras. The atmosphere shifted by fractions, by tendencies rather than events. Carbon continued to leave the air, drawn downward into stone through slow, persistent weathering. Each removal lightened the sky imperceptibly, easing its grip on warmth, inviting cooler intervals to linger. These cooler moments began to repeat, long enough to matter. Methane thinned gradually, not vanishing, but retreating. Sunlight broke it apart high above, reaction by reaction, leaving behind less warming capacity than before. With less methane to hold heat, the surface cooled further. Cooling altered circulation. Altered circulation changed chemistry. The poison adjusted again, redistributing itself without awareness. Clouds grew more reflective, their pale haze scattering sunlight back into space. Days dimmed, nights cooled, contrasts softened. The atmosphere became a gentler regulator of energy, even as its chemistry remained hostile. This gentleness was accidental, a byproduct of balance rather than intention. Nitrogen continued to dominate quietly, maintaining pressure even as other gases waned. Its presence ensured that the sky did not thin too quickly, did not collapse into vulnerability. Density remained sufficient to slow escape, to encourage recycling. The atmosphere held itself together through mass rather than aggression. Oxygen appeared more often now, still rare, still quickly consumed, but less completely erased. When water was split by light, oxygen lingered a moment longer before binding itself to rock or sulfur. These moments were fleeting, but repetition gave them weight. The poison noticed nothing, but chemistry remembered. Iron at the surface reacted quietly, rusting in ways unseen beneath haze and shallow water. Each reaction removed oxygen from circulation, keeping the sky safe from its disruptive presence. But these sinks had limits. Over time, they filled, capacity diminished. The planet's surface slowly lost its ability to absorb all that the sky produced. Lightning continued its work, stitching brief complexity into the clouds. Each strike created new arrangements, some involving oxygen, some stabilizing it briefly in compounds that lasted longer than before. Most still vanished. But a few remained just long enough to influence further reactions. Persistence began to creep in at the edges. Water cycled with increasing regularity, its movements shaping the atmosphere's behavior. Evaporation and condensation redistributed heat more evenly, smoothing extremes. Rain dissolved gases, transported them, returned them altered. The poison became more mixed, more uniform, less prone to local spikes of intensity. The sun's radiation remained steady, fracturing molecules, but escape continued to slow. Density and cooling worked together, keeping fragments close, encouraging recombination. Loss to space persisted, but it no longer defined the sky's character. The atmosphere existed as a closed conversation, recycling itself over long spans. Time allowed feedback to deepen. Cooling reduced escape increased density slowed reactions. Slower reactions allowed methane to persist longer than expected, even as it thinned. Balance held, not perfectly, but long enough to feel stable. This stability mattered. It allowed the sky to become background, to exist without drawing attention to itself. It was poisonous, but predictable. Hostile, but calm. The planet turned beneath it without fear, without urgency, as if nothing would ever need to change. But change was arriving quietly. Carbon continued to vanish into stone. Methane continued to break apart. Oxygen continued to flicker. Each of these processes nudged the atmosphere toward a threshold it did not recognize. The poison that had learned patience was becoming vulnerable to accumulation. When oxygen appeared now, it sometimes found no immediate partner willing to bind it. For a breath of time, it drifted free, reactive, disruptive. These moments were rare, but they mattered. Each one tested the atmosphere's ability to silence it. Each one left a trace. The sky did not yet transform. It did not yet poison itself in a new way, but it was no longer perfectly safe from change. The balance that held it together had narrowed. The poison remained dominant. But patience had limits, and beneath this unbreathable sky, the planet continued to turn, unaware that the air above it was learning a new lesson. One not about endurance, but about accumulation. The atmosphere crossed a quiet line, not with sound, not with rupture, but with accumulation. What had once been erased instantly now lingered. Oxygen, born from light and water, began to remain long enough to matter, not abundant, not safe, but present in ways the sky could no longer completely deny. Each appearance tested the patience of the poison, stretching it thin. Carbon sinks filled slowly, their appetite dulled by saturation. Rock that had once eagerly bound oxygen now did so reluctantly. Iron surfaces grew tired of rusting. Sulfur found fewer partners willing to react. Capacity did not vanish, it diminished. And in that diminishing, the atmosphere changed its behavior. Methane continued its gradual retreat, weakened by light and chemistry, no longer able to compensate fully for cooling. As it thinned, oxygen survived a little longer. Each molecule that remained altered reactions around it, encouraging pathways that had once been suppressed. The poison adjusted, but its adjustments grew slower. Density remained, held by nitrogen's quiet mass. Pressure did not collapse, the sky did not thin. It remained substantial, capable of holding what accumulated. This mattered more than abundance. It allowed change to remain local, to build rather than escape. Lightning still stitched complexity through the clouds, now sometimes creating compounds that stabilized oxygen briefly, protecting it from immediate erasure. These moments were fleeting, but repetition gave them weight. The atmosphere learned new reactions by accident, new ways of holding what it had once rejected. Water continued its cycles, dissolving gases, transporting them, returning them altered. Rain carried oxygen into the surface, where some was consumed, some returned, some stored. Each cycle redistributed the burden of change, preventing any single process from dominating. The poison did not fail. It adapted. The sun continued to fracture molecules above, but the fragments often fell back, recombined, returned. Escape was no longer the primary release valve. Accumulation replaced loss as the dominant force shaping the sky. This shift was subtle, but profound. Time layered itself again, millions of years folding quietly into one another. With each layer, oxygen's presence grew marginally more persistent, still scarce, still dangerous, but no longer negligible. The atmosphere tolerated it not because it wanted to, but because it had lost the ability to erase it completely. The poison that had once ruled through absence now faced a new challenge: presence. It could endure violence. It could endure loss. It had learned patience, but it had not learned how to respond to something that stayed. This was not yet transformation. The sky did not clear. It did not brighten. It did not become breathable. It simply grew tense, balanced on a narrowing ridge where small changes carried large consequences. The atmosphere held itself carefully, adjusting reactions, redistributing energy, attempting to preserve its familiar state. But familiar states rely on boundaries, and those boundaries were softening. What would come next would not be sudden. It would not announce itself as revolution. It would arrive as a slow poisoning of the poison itself, a chemistry that rewrote the sky from within. For now, the poison remained patient. But patience had become vulnerability, and above the turning planet, the air waited, heavy, unchanged to any casual glance, yet already no longer what it had been. Light had always been present, but it had never stayed long enough to matter. For ages, sunlight arrived as force-splitting, heating, erasing, then moved on, leaving the sky much as it had found it. It broke molecules apart, scattered fragments, and let most of the damage heal itself through recombination and loss. Light was an intruder, not a participant. The atmosphere endured it without changing its nature. Then, without announcement, light began to linger. Not in brightness, in consequence. Near the surface, beneath haze and shallow waters, chemistry discovered a way to slow light down. Pigments, simple, unintentional, caught photons and refused to release them immediately. Energy was held, redirected, folded into reactions that no longer vanished as soon as the sun passed overhead. Light stopped being a visitor. It became a collaborator. Oxygen did not arrive suddenly. It seeped. Molecule by molecule, freed from water by captured light, it entered an atmosphere that had never wanted it. At first, nothing changed. Oxygen was consumed, as it always had been, bound to iron, swallowed by sulfur, erased by familiarity. But the rate had shifted. Production no longer depended solely on chance fractures high in the sky. It occurred daily, rhythmically, near the surface. Light had learned repetition. Each cycle added a trace of oxygen to the air. Most vanished. Some lingered. The poison absorbed the intrusion without alarm, redistributing reactions, maintaining balance. But balance had become delicate. The sky had narrowed its tolerance through patience, and now repetition pressed against that narrowing. Methane felt the change first. Oxygen found it easily, reacting, dismantling its warmth. Where methane faded, cooling followed. Where cooling followed, clouds brightened, reflecting more light. Where reflection increased, the surface cooled further. The atmosphere responded to oxygen not with explosion, but with rearrangement. Carbon dioxide remained, but its dominance softened. Weathering accelerated as cooler conditions allowed water to persist longer on rock. Each interaction pulled carbon downward, thinning the air further, reducing its grip on heat. Cooling deepened. Light, once trapped by haze, scattered more freely now, reaching places it never had before. The sky did not clear all at once. It faded slowly, haze thinning by degrees too subtle to mark. The sun did not appear brighter. It appeared steadier. Shadows sharpened. Contrast returned. The atmosphere began to allow difference again between day and night, between region and region. Oxygen continued to rise, not dramatically, but persistently. Each molecule that survived altered reactions around it, encouraging pathways that favored its own endurance. Iron rusted more visibly now, drawing oxygen downward, staining sediments unseen beneath shallow seas. These sinks slowed accumulation, but they could not stop it. Production continued. Light did not tire. Nitrogen watched silently, unchanged, maintaining pressure even as chemistry shifted around it. Its presence prevented collapse, allowed the atmosphere to remain substantial, while its character transformed. The sky did not thin into vulnerability, it thickened into tension. Lightning struck less often now, as conditions stabilized, but its chemistry changed. Oxygen altered the outcomes of each flash, creating new compounds, new possibilities. What once vanished quickly now sometimes persisted, participating in further reactions, deepening complexity. The sky's vocabulary expanded. Water moved differently under this changing air. Cooler temperatures allowed longer residence at the surface. Shallow seas expanded, retreated, expanded again. Each cycle increased contact between air and rock, increasing weathering, increasing carbon burial, simplifying the sky. Simplicity, here, did not mean emptiness. It meant fewer extremes. The atmosphere did not understand what was happening. It adjusted instinctively, redistributing energy, smoothing gradients, maintaining continuity. But light was no longer content to be smoothed away. It insisted, day after day, on freeing oxygen and leaving it behind. This was not the arrival of breath, not yet. It was the arrival of persistence. Light had learned how to change the air not by force, but by patience, by doing the same quiet thing often enough that resistance grew tired. Above the planet, the sky began to feel unfamiliar to itself, still poisonous, still hostile, but increasingly unstable in its familiarity. The poison that had learned patience now faced a chemistry that was even more patient. And somewhere between haze and clarity, between warmth and cooling, the air crossed another invisible line, not into safety, but into inevitability. The change did not accelerate. It deepened. Each day, light returned with the same quiet insistence, touching water and pigment, freeing oxygen in small, reliable measures. There was no surge, no sudden brightening of the sky, only a steady addition that the atmosphere could no longer completely erase. Repetition began to outweigh resistance. Oxygen found itself less alone. Where one molecule lingered, another followed, altering local chemistry just enough to matter. Reactions shifted subtly, favoring pathways that tolerated oxygen's presence rather than annihilating it immediately. The poison adapted, but adaptation required energy, and energy was being spent elsewhere. Methane continued to retreat. Oxygen dismantled it patiently, molecule by molecule, stripping the sky of one of its most effective warming agents. Cooling followed without drama. As temperatures fell, cloud cover brightened, reflecting more sunlight. This reflection reduced heating further, reinforcing the cooling trend. The atmosphere entered a feedback it could not escape. Carbon dioxide's influence weakened as weathering accelerated. Cooler surfaces allowed water to persist longer, to linger against rock, dissolving carbon and carrying it downward. Each removal thinned the sky further, lightening its weight, softening its warmth. The poison lost its grip gradually, almost politely. The sky's color shifted again, becoming clearer, less stained by haze. Light penetrated deeper, reaching waters and surfaces previously shielded. With more light came more oxygen production. With more oxygen came faster methane loss. The cycle reinforced itself, tightening into inevitability. Iron at the surface reacted continuously now, rusting visibly beneath shallow seas, drawing oxygen downward. These reactions slowed accumulation, but they could not halt it. The planet's capacity to absorb oxygen was vast, but not infinite. Each reaction filled a space that would not be available again. Nitrogen continued its quiet stewardship, maintaining pressure, preventing collapse. Without it, the atmosphere might have thinned dangerously as greenhouse gases waned. With it, the sky remained substantial, capable of holding what accumulated. The transformation occurred within continuity, not collapse. Lightning chemistry shifted again, producing compounds that stabilized oxygen longer, sometimes carrying it through reactions that would once have destroyed it. Each strike expanded the atmosphere's tolerance, teaching it new ways to coexist with what it had once rejected. Water cycles intensified as temperature gradients sharpened. Evaporation and condensation redistributed heat efficiently, smoothing extremes while enabling change. Rain carried oxygen into sediments, where some was consumed, some stored, some returned. These exchanges slowed transformation without stopping it. The sun continued its work, fracturing molecules above, but the lower atmosphere grew increasingly insulated from its violence. Density and composition scattered radiation, protecting what lay beneath. Light's influence moved from destruction to construction, from erasure to accumulation. Time layered itself again, millions of years folding quietly. Oxygen rose not to dominance, but to presence. It became a participant rather than a visitor. The sky grew tense, balanced between old chemistry and new persistence. The poison resisted, adjusting reactions, redistributing energy, attempting to maintain its familiar state. But familiarity relied on erasure, and erasure was no longer complete. Each day's production left residue. Each residue altered the next day's outcome. The atmosphere had crossed another threshold, not into breath, but into change that could not be undone. Light had learned how to rewrite the sky not by force, but by patience, by returning again and again with the same quiet intention. The air above the planet began to carry a different kind of memory, one not written in ash or loss, but in repetition. What would follow would not be gentle, but it would be slow, and slow was enough. Cooling spread without announcement, not as ice. As hesitation, the surface no longer rushed heat back into the sky. Warmth lingered unevenly, allowing pockets of cold to persist, to gather meaning. In these cooler intervals, oxygen survived longer, methane faded faster, and clouds brightened further. The atmosphere began to favor reflection over absorption, light over haze. Shallow seas expanded across the surface, lingering longer between evaporation and retreat. Their presence mattered. Water touched rock with patience, dissolving minerals, carrying carbon downward, thinning the sky further. Each contact was a subtraction. Each subtraction altered the balance of warmth and circulation. The poison grew lighter, less dominant, less certain. Oxygen continued to accumulate, slowly, unevenly, but persistently. It did not flood the atmosphere. It crept. Molecule by molecule, it altered reactions, shifting chemistry away from reduction and toward oxidation. Iron rusted openly now, staining sediments with colors unseen beneath dim skies. These reactions consumed oxygen, delaying its rise, but they could not erase it entirely. The sky's composition drifted toward simplicity. Methane's warmth waned, carbon dioxide thinned, nitrogen remained, quiet and abundant, maintaining pressure without demanding influence. The atmosphere felt cleaner, not safer, but less cluttered. Reactions slowed. Extremes softened. Lightning became rarer, but its effects deepened. Each strike occurred in an atmosphere more tolerant of oxygen, producing compounds that persisted longer, participated in further chemistry, expanded the sky's capacity for change. Complexity deepened without hurry. The sun's light reached deeper now, unfiltered by thick haze. It warmed some regions while leaving others cool, increasing contrast, driving circulation that mixed the air thoroughly. This mixing spread oxygen evenly, preventing local spikes that might have triggered sudden transformation. Change remained distributed, gradual. Clouds reflected light efficiently, cooling the surface further. This cooling reinforced weathering, carbon burial, methane loss. The feedback loop tightened, guiding the atmosphere along a narrowing path. The poison adjusted, but its adjustments grew less effective. Oxygen's presence began to influence the upper atmosphere as well. Ozone formed briefly, thin and fragile, absorbing some ultraviolet light, protecting lower layers from destruction. This protection allowed oxygen to persist longer, creating another feedback, subtle but important. Light began to protect the very chemistry it had initiated. The atmosphere did not clear completely. Haze remained, poison remained, but the character of the sky shifted from reduction to oxidation, from patience to inevitability. The air began to carry tension, a sense of imbalance that could not be smoothed away. Time passed quietly. Millions of years deepened these changes without drama. The sky did not become breathable. It did not invite softness. It simply became different, moving toward a state it could no longer avoid. What was once erased instantly now lingered. What lingered began to accumulate. What accumulated began to transform everything around it. Light had learned how to stay in consequence, not in brightness. The atmosphere learned how to change by allowing that consequence to repeat. Above the planet, the sky held itself carefully, aware only through chemistry that it was no longer what it had been. The poison that had learned patience was being rewritten, slowly, by light that refused to leave without leaving something behind. And beneath this changing air, the planet waited, cooling, circulating, preparing for a future that would arrive not as gift, but as inheritance. The atmosphere did not fracture, it thinned into clarity, not suddenly, not cleanly, but enough that the sky began to recognize itself differently. Haze retreated in slow measures, not vanishing, but loosening its grip on light. The sun no longer felt muffled, it felt present. Days carried a steadier illumination, nights cooled with more confidence. Contrast returned to the world, and with contrast came sharper circulation, stronger winds, more deliberate mixing of the air. Oxygen continued its quiet ascent, no longer easily erased, no longer merely tolerated. It shaped reactions now, redirected chemistry, demanded accommodation. Iron rusted until it could rust no more. Sulfur found fewer places to hide. The planet's appetite for oxygen dulled, not because it was satisfied, but because it was finite. Carbon dioxide thinned further, drawn downward into stone and sediment, stored in forms that would not return easily. Its retreat cooled the surface enough to encourage broader, longer-lived seas. Water lingered, weathered, moved carbon with patience. Each cycle simplified the sky, stripping away excess warmth, excess reactivity, excess noise. Methane became rare, its warmth a memory rather than a presence. Without it, the sky lost one of its oldest supports. Cooling deepened, clouds brightened, reflection increased. Light that once warmed now bounced away. The atmosphere learned restraint from absence. Nitrogen remained, unwavering, filling space, maintaining pressure. It did not participate in the struggle. It simply held the stage steady while everything else changed. Without it, the sky might have collapsed or escaped. With it, transformation unfolded within continuity. Ozone formed more reliably now, thin but persistent, absorbing harmful light and protecting lower layers. This protection mattered. It allowed oxygen to survive longer, encouraged further accumulation, reinforced the shift already underway. Light, once destructive, became selective. It learned where to stop. The upper atmosphere cooled, reducing escape further. Loss to space slowed to a background whisper. Accumulation replaced erosion as the dominant force shaping the sky. What arrived stayed. What stayed reshaped everything around it. Lightning still crossed the clouds, rare but meaningful, producing compounds that lasted, participated, altered pathways. Each strike added complexity to a sky that had once erased complexity by default. The atmosphere's chemical memory deepened. Time layered itself again, millions of years folding without sound. Oxygen approached a presence that could no longer be ignored. Still dangerous, still hostile, but transformative. The poison that had learned patience now found itself displaced by a new chemistry that did not ask permission. The sky was no longer alien in the same way. Its hostility had changed character. It no longer suffocated possibility immediately. It challenged it differently, through oxidation, through instability, through change rather than erasure. This was not yet a sky meant for breath, but it was a sky that remembered light. Light had learned how to change the air by staying consistent, by returning daily, by refusing to be a moment. The atmosphere learned how to change by allowing itself to be altered slowly, irrevocably. Above the cooling planet, the sky settled into a new identity. Clearer, cooler, tense with oxygen it could no longer deny. What followed would not arrive as peace. It would arrive as consequence. And the air, once ash, once poison, once patience, now carried the quiet beginning of something that would learn how to breathe. The sky did not rush into gentleness. It slowed into it. What had changed the air was not intention, but accumulation, the quiet insistence of chemistry repeating itself until resistance grew tired. Now the atmosphere entered a different rhythm, one no longer driven by struggle, but by balance practiced over deep time. Oxygen did not surge. It settled. Carbon did not vanish. It found new homes. Nitrogen did not react. It held space. Breath, as a concept, did not yet exist, but the conditions for it began to gather. Oxygen continued to rise, not dramatically, but steadily enough to matter. Its presence reshaped reactions everywhere it touched, turning once stable compounds into temporary arrangements. Iron no longer absorbed it all. Sulfur no longer silenced it completely. The planet's capacity to hide oxygen diminished with each layer of rust. With each filled sink, what remained lingered in the air, shaping it quietly. The atmosphere grew lighter without thinning. Carbon dioxide continued its slow descent into stone, its warmth replaced by balance rather than absence. Cooling stabilized, extremes softened. The sky learned how to hold temperature without violence, how to distribute energy without chaos. Day and night settled into recognizable differences, no longer blurred entirely by haze or heat. Nitrogen became the quiet architecture of the air. Its abundance maintained pressure, giving the atmosphere weight without reactivity. It slowed everything reactions, movement, loss, creating a buffer that allowed other gases to exist without overwhelming one another. In nitrogen's presence, the sky felt spacious, held together by mass rather than force. Ozone strengthened, thin but meaningful, absorbing harmful light, protecting lower layers from destruction. This shield was fragile, easily disrupted, but it mattered. It allowed oxygen to persist longer, encouraged further accumulation, reinforced the slow transition already underway. Light learned where to stop. The atmosphere learned where to hold. Water responded to these changes with patience. Seas expanded and retreated with rhythm rather than surprise. Evaporation and condensation redistributed heat evenly, smoothing gradients, stabilizing climate. Rain fell more often, not as torrents, but as steady exchanges between air and surface. Each drop carried memory, dissolved gases, altered chemistry, returned, changed. Winds traced global patterns now, shaped by rotation, temperature differences, and the steady presence of continents beginning to assert themselves. Circulation mixed the atmosphere thoroughly, preventing stagnation, distributing oxygen evenly, avoiding local extremes that might have destabilized the balance. The sky behaved as a whole. Lightning became rare, but when it came, it mattered deeply. In an oxygen-rich atmosphere, each strike produced new compounds, new pathways, new possibilities. Complexity increased without hurry, without celebration. The sky expanded its chemical vocabulary quietly, storing potential rather than expressing it. Lost to space faded into background silence. Escape still occurred, but it no longer defined the sky's fate. Density, cooling, and magnetic shelter worked together to keep most of the air close. What arrived tended to stay. The atmosphere learned how to remain. This was the long inhale, not a single breath, but a drawn-out gathering. Oxygen accumulated until it became background rather than anomaly. Carbon dioxide stabilized at lower levels, enough to warm without suffocating. Nitrogen filled the rest, steady and forgiving. Together, these gases created an atmosphere that no longer fought itself continuously. Tension eased into equilibrium. The sky grew clearer, but not empty. Clouds drifted with purpose, reflecting light when needed, releasing warmth when allowed. The sun's presence felt moderated rather than overwhelming. Seasons hinted at themselves without declaring dominance. Time moved in cycles now, not just layers. Nothing noticed this change. Nothing celebrated it. The planet simply continued turning beneath an atmosphere that had learned how to inhale slowly, patiently, gathering what it needed without taking too much. Breath was still impossible. Life was still a rumor, but the air had learned how to make room. What came next would not arrive suddenly. It would emerge within this balance, folded into cycles of light and water, hidden within chemistry that now allowed softness to survive longer than a moment. The inhale continued, steady and quiet, carrying with it the memory of ash, of poison, of light, now woven into a sky that could finally afford to wait. Time widened its steps. The atmosphere learned to move slowly without stopping. Oxygen continued its patient rise, not as conquest, but as settlement. It found spaces in the air where it could remain without immediately being consumed, spaces created by filled sinks and softened reactions. Each molecule that stayed altered the balance just enough to invite the next. Accumulation became self-reinforcing. Carbon dioxide stabilized at a gentler presence, no longer dominating warmth, but contributing to it. Cooling slowed. The surface found a temperature range that allowed water to persist without rushing toward vapor or ice. This moderation mattered. It allowed the atmosphere to breathe in cycles rather than convulsions. Nitrogen's quiet mass shaped everything. It filled the sky generously, absorbing energy, moderating reactions, maintaining pressure. Without it, oxygen might have surged too quickly, destabilizing the system. With it, change unfolded within restraint. The air learned how to carry itself. Ozone thickened slightly, still thin, still fragile, but present enough to shape the upper atmosphere. Harmful light was absorbed before it could fracture too much chemistry below. This protection allowed the lower air to remain intact, encouraged continuity, slowed destruction. Light, once a force of erasure, now respected boundaries. Water cycles deepened. Evaporation lifted heat gently. Condensation returned it softly. Rain fell with increasing regularity, not as violence, but as rhythm. Each cycle redistributed gases, carried oxygen into sediments, returned carbon to stone, smoothed extremes. The atmosphere and surface engaged in a slow, mutual shaping. Clouds formed predictable patterns, reflecting light during warm intervals, releasing warmth when cooling threatened. This feedback stabilized climate further, preventing runaway extremes. The sky learned moderation through repetition. Winds traced familiar paths, driven by the planet's rotation and gentle temperature differences. These movements mixed gases thoroughly, preventing local buildups, distributing oxygen evenly. Uniformity replaced volatility. The atmosphere felt whole, cohesive. Lightning's rarity gave its effects weight. Each strike occurred in an air rich enough to support more complex reactions, producing compounds that lingered, participated, and altered subsequent chemistry. The sky's potential deepened quietly. Loss to space became negligible. Escape persisted at the fringes, but it no longer shaped the sky's destiny. Density, cooling, and magnetic shelter held the air close. The atmosphere belonged to the planet now, not to space. Time layered itself again, millions of years of continuity without drama. Oxygen reached levels that would have been unimaginable under earlier skies, yet nothing dramatic occurred. No explosion, no collapse, just endurance. This was the inhale stretched across eons, a gathering of balance, a filling of space with possibility rather than urgency. The sky did not yet offer breath, but it allowed it to be imagined. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen found a rhythm together, a quiet agreement about proportions and behavior. The atmosphere ceased to rewrite itself constantly. It entered a phase of relative stability, where change occurred slowly enough to be noticed only by the future. The planet rested beneath this sky, its surface cooling, its chemistry diversifying, its cycles repeating. Nothing demanded attention. Nothing needed to be erased. The long inhale continued, steady and unremarkable, building a background against which something delicate might eventually appear and remain long enough to matter. What would follow would not disrupt this balance immediately. It would emerge within it, subtle and patient, shaped by the very air that had learned how to hold itself. The sky, once ash, once poison, once light's canvas, now carried the weight of possibility without knowing it. It inhaled slowly, quietly, preparing space for a breath that would not belong to it alone. Balance did not mean stillness. It meant restraint. The atmosphere moved now with a confidence earned through patience, circulating without urgency, changing without collapse. Oxygen no longer felt like an intruder. It behaved like a resident reactive, yes, but expected. Its presence shaped chemistry everywhere, not as disruption, but as background influence. Reactions accounted for it, pathways bent around it, the sky adapted fully. Carbon found its way downward steadily, sequestered into stone and sediment, locked away in forms that would not return easily. This removal no longer threatened collapse. The atmosphere had learned how to warm without excess, how to cool without freezing. The balance held, not because it was perfect, but because it was flexible. Nitrogen continued to provide the silence between reactions. It filled the air with space, cushioning energy, moderating collisions. In its presence, chemistry slowed just enough to allow persistence. Fragile arrangements could survive longer than moments. This survival mattered. Ozone refined its presence in the upper air, absorbing the harshest light, protecting what lay beneath. This shield was uneven, thin, but sufficient. It allowed continuity where fragmentation once ruled. The sky no longer had to rebuild itself daily. It could remain. Water moved with confidence now, its cycles deep and reliable. Oceans expanded, retreated, expanded again, shaping coastlines that remembered their outlines. Rain fell with regularity, redistributing heat and matter gently. Each cycle reinforced stability. Each repetition deepened memory. Clouds reflected and retained light with practiced ease, smoothing seasonal contrasts, preventing extremes. The atmosphere behaved like a system aware of its limits, adjusting before crisis rather than after. Feedback loops matured into habits. Winds traced global paths, steady and familiar, mixing the air thoroughly. No region hoarded oxygen or carbon. Uniformity protected against runaway change. The sky felt even, continuous, planetary. Lightning became a rare punctuation, its chemistry rich with possibility. Each strike occurred in an atmosphere capable of remembering it, producing compounds that lingered, interacted, influenced future reactions. Complexity deepened quietly, stored rather than expressed. Time passed without event. Millions of years accumulated like dust, settling into layers that felt like silence. Under this sky, nothing demanded immediate change. The atmosphere allowed waiting. This waiting mattered. It created a window where softness could exist without being erased, where structures could form and persist long enough to influence their surroundings, where chemistry could begin to organize itself without being undone by extremes. The inhale reached its fullness not as a peak, but as a plateau. Oxygen stabilized, carbon dioxide settled, nitrogen held everything together. The sky stopped rewriting itself aggressively. It entered a phase of listening. The planet turned beneath this air, its surface now patterned with water and stone, its cycles repeating with confidence. The atmosphere became background present, essential, but no longer dominant. This was the long inhale completed, not a breath taken in a moment, but one drawn across ages, filling the sky with conditions that could sustain something fragile. What followed would not be dramatic. It would be quiet. It would be small. But it would endure because the air had learned how to endure first. The sky, once defined by ash and loss, now held space without knowing why. It had inhaled enough to make room for what would come next. And in that room, something waited. Nothing announced the moment the inhale became habit. No crest, no release. The atmosphere simply continued, carrying its balance forward without needing to prove it. Oxygen held its place, neither surging nor retreating. Carbon remained mostly below, stored in stone and silence. Nitrogen filled the rest, unreactive, dependable, giving the sky its breadth. Together, they formed an air that did not strain against itself. Ozone persisted as a thin memory of light's restraint, absorbing what once would have torn the sky apart. Protection was no longer accidental. It was patterned. Not perfect, but sufficient. Enough to allow continuity to feel ordinary. Water deepened its rhythms. Oceans widened, cooled, and learned their own patience. Evaporation and rain continued their quiet exchange, smoothing heat, carrying gases, shaping surface and sky together. Each cycle reinforced the sense that time could pass without erasure. Clouds moved with familiarity now, their presence neither threatening nor rare. They softened sunlight, guarded warmth, moderated extremes. The sky adjusted gently, correcting itself before imbalance could grow loud. Feedback became intuition. Winds remained steady, tracing paths that felt remembered rather than invented. They mixed the air thoroughly, preventing excess, preserving uniformity. The atmosphere behaved like a single body rather than a collection of parts. Lightning's rare flashes stitched complexity into this calm, leaving behind compounds that lingered and interacted. These moments did not disrupt balance. They enriched it, adding depth without noise. The sky accumulated potential quietly. Lost to space was distant now, a faint whisper at the edge of influence. What the atmosphere held, it kept. What it gained, it integrated. The sky belonged to the planet with confidence. Time settled. Ages passed without demanding change. The inhale did not end. It became background, a steady holding of conditions that no longer needed constant correction. The air felt complete, not finished, but ready. This readiness was subtle. It did not promise safety. It did not guarantee breath. But it allowed softness to last longer than moments. It allowed patterns to persist. It allowed chemistry to remember itself. The planet rested beneath this sky, turning slowly, carrying oceans and continents through cycles that felt rehearsed rather than improvised. Nothing rushed. Nothing needed to. The long inhale had done its work not by creating something new, but by making room, by holding space gently enough that what arrived next would not be erased immediately. What followed would emerge quietly within this air, shaped by it, dependent on it, changing it in return. The sky did not yet know this. It only knew how to remain. And what remains long enough begins to matter. Some truths are not announced. They are inhaled, slowly, patiently, until the world is ready to carry them. Breath arrived without permission, not claimed, not offered. It did not belong to the sky, nor to the surface beneath it. It existed between an exchange made possible by patience, by balance, by an atmosphere that had learned how to hold without deciding who it was holding for. The air no longer resisted softness. It allowed it to linger. Oxygen had become ordinary, not abundant enough to announce itself, not rare enough to feel dangerous. It moved through the atmosphere as background, shaping reactions quietly, participating without drama. Carbon remained mostly absent, folded into stone and sediment, returning only when cycles demanded it. Nitrogen filled the space between, giving the sky its calm weight. Together, they formed an air that could be shared without knowing who would share it. Nothing in this sky was designed. Nothing was promised. The atmosphere existed as a condition rather than an intention. It pressed gently downward, neither suffocating nor escaping, maintaining a pressure that allowed exchange. Molecules moved freely, collided softly, carried energy without violence. The air felt open, not empty, capable of receiving without needing to give. Water continued its long conversation with the sky. Oceans breathed upward through evaporation, returning through rain, redistributing heat and matter with practiced ease. Each cycle reinforced the neutrality of the air. Nothing was hoarded, nothing was owned. Movement itself became balance. Ozone persisted quietly above, thin but vigilant, absorbing what would otherwise fracture the calm. Its presence allowed continuity without demanding attention. Protection had become background, unnoticed because it worked. Winds traced familiar paths, mixing the air thoroughly, preventing isolation. No region held a different sky. Uniformity was protection. Difference was allowed, but extremes were softened before they could dominate. The atmosphere behaved like a commons, shared equally by surface and space. Lightning returned occasionally, its chemistry now rich with possibility rather than disruption. Each flash rearranged molecules in ways that lingered, interacted, deepened complexity without breaking calm. These moments did not belong to storms alone. They belonged to the air itself, testing what it could carry. Time passed gently. Millions of years folded without sound. The atmosphere did not demand change. It permitted it. Softness could exist here long enough to matter, long enough to leave traces, long enough to influence what came next. This breath did not belong to any single process. It was shaped by light, by stone, by water, by silence. It carried the memory of ash and poison and patience without announcing any of it. The air did not remember consciously. It remembered by remaining. What moved within this sky would not own it. What used it would not define it. The atmosphere had become shared space, a medium rather than a message, a passage rather than a possession. Breath that belongs to no one is breath that can be taken by anything gentle enough to survive it. The sky did not choose its future. It made room for it, and in that room, something small waited, not yet named, not yet fragile enough to fail, not yet aware that the air above it was older than memory itself. The air learned how to be unnoticed. Its greatest achievement was silence. No longer did the sky demand attention through violence or scarcity. It existed as background, as condition, as something assumed rather than questioned. Oxygen moved through it without ceremony. Nitrogen held it open. Carbon drifted in trace amounts, just enough to remind the system of warmth without pressing too hard. The balance felt effortless, though it had taken billions of years to practice. Breath became possible not because the air invited it, but because it no longer rejected it. Molecules traveled freely now, colliding softly, exchanging energy without destruction. Pressure remained steady, firm enough to hold water in its liquid patience, gentle enough to allow movement without strain. The atmosphere pressed down like a memory that had learned how to be kind, not through intention but through erosion of excess. Water continued its endless exchange, lifting into the sky and returning again, carrying heat upward, delivering calm downward. Rain fell with regularity, not as event, but as continuation. Each drop dissolved gases, rearranged chemistry, returned altered. The air and the surface shaped one another so thoroughly that the boundary between them softened. Ozone persisted, thin and quiet, absorbing what little violence still arrived from above. Light learned where to stop. What once tore molecules apart now passed gently, warming rather than breaking. The upper sky cooled, held, protected what lay beneath. The atmosphere no longer rebuilt itself daily. It endured. Winds traced slow, reliable paths, redistributing heat and composition evenly. No pocket of air was isolated long enough to become extreme. Uniformity became safety. The sky learned how to protect itself by sharing everything it had. Lightning, rare and restrained, no longer scarred the atmosphere. Its chemistry lingered, adding depth without disruption. Each flash reminded the air of its own capacity for change. Without forcing it, possibility remained stored, not expressed. Time widened further. Ages passed without urgency. The atmosphere did not evolve quickly now. It refined itself, smoothing small imbalances, correcting gently, never overreacting. This restraint allowed persistence. This was an air that could be entered and left without being owned. It did not cling. It did not resist. It allowed exchange freely, carrying heat, carrying vapor, carrying trace chemistry wherever motion required. The sky became a commons where nothing claimed dominance for long. What moved beneath it felt no declaration. What would one day move within it would not feel welcomed or unwelcome. It would simply find that the air was there. Breath that belongs to no one does not announce itself as gift. It exists as permission without intent. It does not promise survival. It allows the attempt. The planet continued turning, carrying this air with quiet confidence. The sky no longer changed the surface through force. It guided gently, nudging temperature, redistributing energy, maintaining the conditions under which subtlety could survive. Memory lived in this atmosphere not as record, but as behavior. Every cycle repeated because it had worked before. Every correction was small because extremes were no longer needed. The air remembered how to remain. What would emerge next would not reshape the sky immediately. It would fit within it, shaped by it, dependent on it. The atmosphere would not notice at first. It would continue doing what it had learned to do. Hold, circulate, wait. And in that waiting, something learned how to draw the air inward, not as possession but as participation. Breath did not announce itself as a boundary. It blurred one. The air became a medium through which exchange could happen without resistance. A quiet passage where inside and outside lost their sharpness. Molecules moved in and out of spaces without permission, without memory of where they had been before. Nothing in the sky insisted on ownership. Nothing demanded exclusivity. The atmosphere had learned neutrality. Oxygen flowed evenly now, neither rare nor overwhelming. It participated in chemistry without rewriting it constantly. Reactions accounted for its presence the way stone accounts for gravity, by adapting shape rather than resisting force. Carbon lingered in traces, returning occasionally from stone and water, offering warmth without weight. Nitrogen remained the silence between them, the space that allowed movement without collapse. Together, they created an air that did not feel imposed. Pressure held steady, gentle, and reliable. It allowed water to remain liquid, allowed surfaces to cool without cracking, allowed gases to mingle without fleeing. The sky pressed down not as burden, but as presence. It reminded the surface that it was not alone, that it was held within something patient. Water continued its cycles with deep familiarity. Oceans exhaled slowly, lifting vapor into the air, where it drifted, condensed, and returned. Each cycle carried heat away from where it gathered too strongly and returned it where absence threatened. This exchange shaped climate not through command, but through conversation. The air listened. The surface responded. Neither dominated. Clouds drifted without urgency, forming and dissolving as needed, reflecting light gently, guarding warmth quietly. Their movements softened extremes before they could grow sharp. The sky learned to correct itself early, without drama. Stability no longer required force. Winds traced their long routes across the planet, steady and remembered, redistributing heat, moisture, and composition with patience. No region hoarded a different air for long. Mixing became protection. Uniformity became resilience. The atmosphere preserved itself by refusing to fragment. Ozone remained above, thin and faithful, absorbing what little violence still arrived from the Sunday light. No longer ruled the sky through destruction. It warmed, guided, illuminated. The atmosphere had taught light where to stop, and light had learned restraint. Lightning returned occasionally, but without the chaos it once brought. Its chemistry lingered now, weaving complexity into calm, producing compounds that did not vanish immediately. These moments added depth rather than disruption. The sky stored potential quietly, without expressing it. Time moved without pressure. Ages passed like slow breaths themselves, each one reinforcing patterns that had proven gentle enough to last. The atmosphere did not reinvent itself. It refined itself, smoothing small imbalances, correcting without erasing. Change became subtle enough to be mistaken for stillness. This air did not belong to the planet alone. It interacted constantly with space, with stone, with water, with light. But it no longer surrendered itself easily, nor did it cling. Exchange replaced loss. Participation replaced erosion. Breath that belongs to no one is breath that cannot be claimed. It exists without allegiance, without preference. It does not choose what will move within it. It simply allows movement to occur. What would come to use this air would not find it waiting, welcoming, or prepared. It would find it indifferent in the most generous way. The sky would not adjust itself quickly to accommodate anything new. It would remain as it was, offering no guarantees. This indifference was its gift, because what survives in an indifferent medium does so by fitting, not by being favoured. What persists learns the rhythm of the air rather than demanding the air learn it. The atmosphere had become a place where nothing was promised, but much was possible. It held memory not as record, but as behaviour repeated because it worked. It carried the imprint of ash, of poison, of light, of patience, folded so deeply into its structure that none of it needed to be remembered explicitly. The planet turned beneath this sky, unhurried, carrying oceans and continents through cycles that felt settled rather than temporary. The air moved with it, neither leading nor following, simply present. Breath that belongs to no one does not announce the arrival of life. It does not anticipate it. It does not celebrate it. It waits. And in that waiting, the sky became the quiet condition under which something could begin to take air inward, not as conquest, not as need, but as participation in a rhythm older than itself. Nothing claimed the air, and so the air claimed nothing in return. The atmosphere rested in its neutrality, holding balance without intention, allowing exchange without judgment. Oxygen moved freely, not as gift, not as threat, but as background. Carbon drifted in quiet traces, returning from stone and water when cycles required it, leaving again without argument. Nitrogen filled the space between all things, the quiet majority that made movement possible without collapse. The sky felt complete, not finished, but sufficient. Pressure remained gentle and constant, pressing down just enough to allow liquid water to linger, to allow surfaces to cool without breaking, to allow molecules to meet and part without violence. The air did not announce itself as support. It simply existed in a form that no longer erased softness immediately. Water continued its long breathing with the sky. Oceans lifted vapor slowly, returning it as rain with patient regularity. Each cycle redistributed heat and matter with practiced ease. The atmosphere did not dominate this exchange. It participated. Conversation replaced command. The boundary between air and surface softened into familiarity. Clouds drifted without urgency, forming and dissolving as needed, reflecting light gently, releasing warmth quietly. Extremes were corrected before they could grow loud. Stability arrived, not as control, but as early listening. The sky adjusted itself without needing to be noticed. Winds traced remembered paths, mixing the air thoroughly, preventing isolation. No place held a different breath for long. Uniformity became resilience. The atmosphere protected itself by refusing to fragment, by sharing everything it had. Ozone persisted above, thin and faithful, absorbing what little violence still arrived from the Sunday light no longer tore at the sky. It warmed, guided, illuminated. The atmosphere had taught light where to stop, and light had learned restraint. Destruction gave way to maintenance. Lightning's rare appearances stitched complexity into calm, leaving behind chemistry that lingered and interacted without disrupting balance. The sky stored possibility quietly, carrying depth without expressing it. Nothing rushed toward becoming something else. Time passed like a held breath that never needed release. Ages folded into one another without urgency. The atmosphere refined itself gently, smoothing small imbalances, correcting without erasing. Change became subtle enough to be mistaken for stillness. This air did not belong to the planet alone. It touched space and stone and water and light continuously, but it no longer surrendered itself easily, nor did it cling. Exchange replaced loss. Participation replaced erosion. The sky had learned how to remain without insisting on permanence. Breath that belongs to no one cannot be owned. It cannot be promised. It cannot be taken for granted. It exists as a condition, one that allows entry without invitation and survival without guarantee. What moves within it must learn its rhythm rather than demand accommodation. What endures does so by fitting, not by being favoured. The atmosphere carried memory without recollection. It remembered ash in its density, poison in its balance, light in its clarity. These histories were folded so deeply into its behaviour that they no longer needed to be named. The sky did not look backward. It continued. And beneath this air, the planet turned quiet, patient, complete in its indifference. Oceans breathed. Stone waited. Light returned each day without urgency. What would come to draw this breath inward would not hear the story of how the sky learned to exist. It would not know the ages of fire and loss, the patience of poison, the persistence of light. It would simply find that the air was there. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? Perhaps it did not forget. Perhaps it learned how to hold its memory so gently that it felt like silence. The sky did not end. It faded into background, like mist at dawn, like a planet exhaling after 4 billion years of remembering. The sky does not remember itself as a beginning. It remembers as condition. What once rose as ash, what lingered as poison, what softened under light never disappeared. It settled, it thinned, it folded inward until history became behavior rather than story. The atmosphere did not keep records, it kept balance, and balance was enough. Breath was never a destination, it was a consequence, a slow permission shaped by fire cooling, by gases learning weight, by light learning restraint. The air that now surrounds the planet is not gentle because it chose to be. It is gentle because everything that could not endure was worn away by time. What remains is not perfect. It is practiced. The planet does not offer this air as a gift. It does not guarantee survival within it. The sky belongs to no one because ownership would imply intention, and intention was never part of its making. This breath exists because patience outlasted chaos, because repetition outlived violence, because time favored what could remain quiet long enough to matter. Every inhale carries fragments of vanished skies. Every exhale releases echoes of ash, of sulfur, of light filtered through haze no longer present. The air holds these memories without speaking them. It carries the past not as warning, but as texture. What moves within this atmosphere is temporary. What breathes is brief. But the conditions that allow breathing were not accidental. They were learned. Slowly, reluctantly, across a world that never rushed to become familiar. And so the circle closes where it began, not with certainty, not with answers, but with a softened question drifting through the air itself. What if Earth once knew something and forgot? Perhaps the forgetting was the lesson. Perhaps survival is not memory held tightly, but memory worn smooth enough to feel like silence. The planet continues to turn, the sky continues to hold, and breath, belonging to no one, passes through, quiet, borrowed, and endlessly returning to where it came from.